Matt Dickinson. Matt is professor of political science at Middlebury College, previously taught at Harvard University, where he also received his PhD. His work focuses on the U.S. presidency, and on his last sabbatical, he traveled throughout the U.S. seeing firsthand the Trump campaign in action.
Not just Trump.
Not just Trump, okay. He is here today to present The Year of Living Dangerously, Donald Trump in the White House. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate you all coming out here, and it's such a beautiful day. I figured nobody would show up, just because finally we have sunshine and warm weather. But I will try to make it worth your while. I'll try to do better than this guy did. This was me with Al Jazeera Television. They called me to ask about Donald Trump, and so I was on television, and I asked them to send me the clip, and this is what they sent me. Me falling asleep in my own television interview. So I don't know what the signal they were sending here, but I'll try to keep you awake as much as I can. Nancy was kind enough to remind me that at one of my previous talks, I confidently assured you that if the polling was right, Donald Trump was unlikely to be elected president. So I'm not sure why you keep letting me back. But I want to talk about Donald Trump. I've changed my title slightly just because this is a take on something that came up after I submitted my title, which was some discussion about Donald Trump's mental stability. And he responded to accusations that he was unstable by saying no. Not only was he stable, he was a stable genius. This was in one of his tweets. And all kidding aside, his presidency has presented challenges to citizens on how to make sense of it, challenges to understand why he won election, but also as a political scientist, sort of putting him in the context of what we thought we know about elections and about the American political system in general. So what I want to argue today is that Trump is as much a symptom as he is a cause of the current instability that we are seeing in our institutions. And by instability, I want to make the argument that Americans are deeply dissatisfied with their political system. They're dissatisfied with their political institutions, their political leaders, their two major parties. And as a result, A, they're willing to take a chance on non-politicians as presidents, and that partly explains Donald Trump. But it's also the case that they don't trust either of the major political parties to chart the way for the future. And that's reflected in the turmoil and close competitiveness we've seen in elections in recent, really the last decade. It's an unprecedented period that we are in historically in terms of public dissatisfaction with our leaders and our parties. So what I'm going to do here is spend the first half of the talk sort of briefly reacquainting you with the major highlights or lowlights, as the case might be with the Trump presidency. You're all familiar with them, but I'll go through them relatively quickly, and stop me at any point if you have questions about anything I'm saying or slides. I tend to throw a lot of slides at you. People who've been to my talks before realize this. And then I want to spend the second half of the talk, again, roughly 15, 20 minutes, stepping back from Trump and saying, what's he mean? What is the significance of Trump for the American political system? And then open it up for questions, which I'm sure from previous experience, I know you have a lot of them. So I want to talk first about Donald Trump. It's early in his presidency. What kind of a president is he? And again, many of you, I see some of you shaking your heads. You know I'm a political scientist. I don't vote, much to the chagrin of my students' parents. So I'm going to sort of present what I think is somewhat objective perspective on his presidency, saying nothing about what he's trying to accomplish as his president. And we can talk about that, or what he thinks he wants to accomplish. But the idea of rating a president is something that my mentor, a man named Richard Neustadt, who taught for many years at Harvard University and wrote the best-selling book on the presidency, says is something we all do. This is the opening paragraph from his book. In the United States, we like to write a president. We measure him as weak or strong and call what we are measuring his leadership. And we don't wait until he's dead. We evaluate a president from the moment he takes office, and we are quite right to do so. By the way, if you want to learn more about him, this is the edited volume I took. It's a great stocking stuffer. It's on Amazon. I don't see anyone writing it down.
We can remember it.
So, what do we think of Donald Trump? Well, one of the things that, sort of a parlor game that political scientists and historians and others are involved in is periodically various media agencies will call us up and ask us to rate the presidents and put Donald Trump in with all the other presidents. And this happened recently. I was actually part of this, so I thought I'd just sort of get the conversation going and show you how scholars rate Donald Trump. This is from a survey that was, I believe, by Quinnipiac. It was published in the New York Times about 2 months ago. And it follows up a survey they did in 2014, so 4 years ago. And it asked you to rate the presidents from 0, being an utter failure, to 100, being godlike in their qualities, and added all up our ratings and ranked the presidents. And you're not surprised, the top 3, as in, and these surveys go on periodically. There's literally been dozens of them. And historically, and I don't know how well you can see that, but that's Lincoln, Washington, and Roosevelt. I usually rated the top 3 presidents, as they are here. And you can see from 2014, that has not changed. In fact, the top 7 presidents have not changed. So we go Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson, Truman, and Eisenhower as your top 7. And then we've seen some movement. And some of that movement is predictable. So in 2014, Bill Clinton was rated 8th. He's now 13th. 4 years, he's dropped 5 slots. Anyone want to know why? Anyone want to get a guess why? Hillary, right? That's the halo effect. You were often evaluated based on your spouse. Let that be a reminder to you. And we've seen other people. Andrew Jackson, his treatment of, he became less liked as a result of some historical studies, and they're going to take him off what bill is he on, the 20 is it? Anyhow, they're going to change him and try to put a woman on there. He's dropped. And some of the other ones are interesting. Ronald Reagan has gone up to, he's now 11th. He's now 9th. He was 11. It's a little boomlet for him. One of the more interesting ones is Obama. He is now 8th. He was 18th. So he's made the biggest leap. He's gone up 10. And why? Because suddenly he doesn't look so bad, does he, right? So this should be a reminder also that our evaluations of more recent presidents are the most subjective. It takes a while for them to crystallize. So we see much less movement among presidents who have been evaluated for decades. But the recent ones, we're still trying to get a handle on their legacy, in part because the legacy is partly a function of who comes after them. So, who's missing here? Anyone? This is the top 31. What's that?
Where's Trump?
Yeah, Trump's not. So apparently Trump is not in the top 30 of all-time great presidents. And in fact, he's not. Here we go. Tyler Fillmore won. Andrew Johnson was impeached. William Henry Harrison died after a month in office. James Buchanan got us in a civil war. But they're all rated higher than poor Donald Trump, who is rated the least effective president of all time. Now, do I agree with that? Do I not agree with that? It's early, obviously. He's a little over a year into his presidency, and who knows? He may bring peace to North Korea. The economy is booming. So there's a lot of time for him to change that impression. But it does reflect, I think, something we can all agree on regarding partisanship. He's had a rocky first year. Rocky in the sense that there's been turmoil. Well, I'll talk to you about how rocky it is. And I'm not going to go through here, but I just want you to know We did break down the evaluations from scholars who I self-identify as Democrat, scholars like myself who don't identify, and scholars who are Republican. And there are predictable variations. So among Democrats, Obama's 6th, whereas he's 16th among Republicans. Whereas Ronald Reagan is 5th among Republicans, but he's not even in the top 10 among Democrats. So there are some variations, but again, the regular rule of thumb here, the more recent presidents are where you see more of that partisan variation. Okay, and even among Republicans, Donald Trump doesn't move much higher. He's 40th. So below him is the president who was impeached, the one-term president, the one who died in office after a month, and the guy who got us in the Civil War. So it's a low bar that he's cleared here. Okay. Now, one thing I want to point out is Trump has not accomplished a lot. We'll talk about how much he's accomplished. But most presidents don't accomplish a lot. In fact, the presidency, according to my mentor, Richard Neustadt, the thesis of his book is the presidency is an inherently weak office. Except in times of crisis, presidents cannot accomplish a lot on their own. And we saw this with Barack Obama. We saw this with George W. Bush, who after the sort of crisis of 9/11 began to recede, became very unpopular, and saw his legislative program basically stop. So there are a lot of fear when Donald Trump was running that he would be an authoritarian president, and he would sort of run roughshod over the Constitution. And I would argue he may have authoritarian tendencies, and read his tweets, and you get a sense of that. How many, by the way, are on Twitter? None of you. You're not missing out on a lot except the entertainment value. And I can tell you, journalists, the first thing they do when they wake up is they look at Twitter to see what the President of the United States has said overnight in 140 characters. Well, it's now up to 280 characters or less. And it's often quite entertaining and at the same time a little worrisome to have the President of the United States calling the leader of a nation with nuclear weapons Rocket Man, for instance. But Neustadt's point is we should not be surprised that Trump hasn't got a lot done. The president, in general, is an inherently weak office in terms of effective influence. Even if they have authoritarian tendencies, it's very difficult for them to carry those out. But Trump, I would suggest, is weaker than most, and partly because of the circumstances of his election, which I will talk about briefly. Partly because he's trying to preside in a period of unprecedented polarization in Congress. And by polarization, I mean Democrats are united on their agenda, Republicans are united on their agenda, and they look at each other as enemies. And if Donald Trump wants to do something, Democrats automatically will oppose it. And this isn't a criticism of Democrats. Republicans did the same thing with Barack Obama. It's just a tendency when we have two very homogeneous, ideologically speaking, political parties in Congress, and I'm going to show you evidence to show these are the most polarized parties in over 100 years. It is very difficult for the president to get major legislation through because major legislation requires bipartisanship. We don't have bipartisanship. So with rare exceptions, if Trump is going to get anything done, he has to rely on his own party. And here's the problem. His own party has a very slim majority, meaning that in the Senate in particular, one or two senators can defect from the Republican Party and he can't get anything done, as we saw what happened with John McCain and Susan Collins on health care. So not only does he must hold his party together, he must realize he's never going to attract any support from the opposing party. And if by chance somebody who has bipartisan leanings decides, I might work with Donald Trump, or I might try to put together a bipartisan coalition, they will immediately be attacked by the donor class, the political elites, the activists, who will primary them. That is, they will run a candidate who in the Democratic Party is more to the left. Think about Bernie Sanders challenging Hillary Clinton. And I'm not criticizing them, I'm just telling you, you pay a price for compromise. Or in the Republican Party, you think about candidates to the right, for all of our criticisms of Donald Trump. There are a lot more extreme right-wing candidates in the Republican Party. So the party polarization is reinforced by political activists and donors who punish you if you try to work in bipartisan fashion because you've abandoned the party's principles. They are the purists. And finally, we're in a period of long-term nationalization of congressional elections. What does that mean? It means Donald Trump's, all presidents' fates rise and fall with their party in Congress. And we take this kind of for granted, but this is a relatively new development. So I'm just going to run through these very quickly, but it meant that Trump, the context in which Trump took office was very limited in his ability to get things done. Having said that, he managed to make it worse. He chose the wrong policies to push, repealing health care. He got embroiled in scandals, beginning with Russian collusion, which has morphed into obstruction of justice, which has morphed into charges of financial misdeed. We don't know which one it's going to be. It keeps evolving. He, of course, has not helped himself. He's the tweeter-in-chief, and almost anybody who studies the presidency thinks his tweets have taken away from his ability to focus on the good things that are happening in the country. He just focuses on the controversial ones. His behavior has raised questions about whether he's even mentally competent, fit for office. It's never good when people are assessing your mental stability as president. And he has managed to go through, as I'll show you in a moment, a White House shuffle that is unprecedented in terms of bringing people in, firing them, sending them out, and not just the White House, but we now have the Secretary of State has been replaced, his National Security Advisor has been replaced, his Health and Human Secretary has been replaced. Unprecedented turnover. Now, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is some evidence that Donald Trump is getting a handle on the job. A couple of major legislative accomplishments, tax reform and the budget deal. Now, when I say major, they're significant in that they're important. I'm not saying you agree with them, and I'm guessing many of you do not agree with the tax cut plan, but it still was a significant piece of legislation. Okay, but we have the upcoming midterms, and if history holds, Republicans are going to lose seats in the midterms. So he is probably coming out of the midterms in a weaker position than he is now. All right, that's sort of the context. I'm just going to briefly go through his presidency. As you know, the first 100 days is when you want to hit the ground running. He hit the ground stumbling. He made a series of early choices. Steve Bannon, who was a brilliant campaign strategist, but a horrible White House official, as he realized himself when he resigned. His chief of staff, Reince Priebus, was supposed to be liaison to sort of the Republican Party, but Trump never listened to him. So if you have a chief of staff who nobody listens to, you're not very effective. He was fired. Michael Flynn, his first national security advisor, lied to the FBI about his contacts with Russians. He's now under investigation. Sean Spicer turned out to be a horrible communications expert. Then his first policy right out of the gate, based on Bannon, he issued a travel ban on immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim nations. Immediately was challenged in court. It was overturned. That's not how you hit the ground running. And he decided his first major legislative effort would be repealing Obamacare. That went nowhere. So he sort of made things worse. And then, of course, for inexplicable reasons that are still playing out today, he decided to fire FBI Director James Comey. And that set in motion the decision by the Assistant Attorney General Rod Rosenstein to appoint a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller. And we've had the drip, 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 drip of revelations about possible collusion, obstruction of justice. Comey himself has parlayed that into a speaking tour on his book, A Higher Royalty. Sorry, not royalty, a higher loyalty. Which may or may not be helping his reputation, but it's certainly helping his bottom line. And of course, perhaps the lowest point of Trump's presidency, I stayed up late night, I was blogging away on my presidential power blog, John McCain striding to the center of the Senate floor, thumbs down, voting against health care reform or repeal, killing the first major legislative initiative. And it's no surprise that when his presidency had bottomed out, he turned to hire John Kelly as his chief of staff. Kelly has proved very controversial, not least among Trump. And he's tried to rein Trump in. Trump only partly has allowed himself to be disciplined. But Kelly's brought some order to the White House, mostly by clearing house. So under his leadership, Anthony Scaramucci was brought in before Kelly. It lasted 10 days. He was fired. Steve Bannon was forced out. Omarosa, remember her from Celebrity Apprentice? Turned out she was a better celebrity apprentice than she was a White House apprentice. She was forced out. Rob Porter resigned after allegations of spousal abuse with not one but two ex-wives. And the unfortunate thing for that is he was incredibly competent as a staff secretary, probably the most competent person they had in the White House. He was forced out. Hope Hicks, who had been Trump's longtime communications director, saw her opportunity to jump ship. And of course, most recently, he's fired his chief economic advisor and his chief national security advisor. Again, Kelly is behind these. So he's refashioning the White House, instilling some discipline. It hasn't been perfect, but it also has created the perception of a White House in chaos, and the media loves that, and it's not wrong. So what I have here is the blue is your first year as president, green your second year, purple your third year, and so on, and this is total turnover. And this is the number of turnover in senior White House assistants dating back to Ronald Reagan over the course of their presidency. And of course, we don't have Donald Trump's. But just look at your first year, the light blue. You can see Donald Trump has had far greater turnover in his White House than any president dating back to Ronald Reagan. Now you might say, well, this is a good thing, because he's getting rid of people like Steve Bannon and replacing them with John Kelly, but it creates a perception, not undeserved, that your White House is in disarray. And it makes it harder for you to sort of put your team together and get things done. He's sort of starting from scratch here. And so it's not surprising with this overview I gave you that he's had incredibly negative media coverage. Now this is by Pew Research, and it looks at both print and television coverage, and it codes it as being either positive, negative, or neither. And you can see this is through the first year of each of these presidents, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And you can see of those presidents, Obama got by far the most positive coverage and the least negative. Donald Trump is the reverse. More than half of his coverage has been negative, only 5% positive. Now we can debate whether this is media bias, whether this is accurate, but the reality is whatever the motivations are, this guy's presidency is awash in negative coverage. And I can understand why Donald Trump is frustrated by this, although, to be fair, Donald Trump has created a lot of this as well. But he's decided to make the media his enemy. And not only is the coverage negative, but it disproportionately focuses on him as opposed to his ideology. So here, Pew Research, the same study, has coded the news coverage in terms of its topics. Do you cover ideology and agenda, the issues you're pushing, or do you cover the person themselves? And you can see both Clinton and Bush, it was mostly ideology and issues. Obama, it was about half and half. And again, this isn't saying it's negative necessarily. So a lot of Obama's personal coverage was positive of him. But look at Trump. About 70% of his coverage focuses on him. Donald Trump, the individual, right? And again, we would say, well, that's understandable because Donald Trump believes the presidency is about him. And he's sort of self-aggrandizing. But the reality is that's unusual. And it's raised questions about whether he's actually mentally fit for office. And Democrats, and this was partly staged, brought a Yale University psychiatry professor to Capitol Hill to brief them about Donald Trump's mental stability. In private meetings that, of course, were leaked by Democrats, she said, you should watch out. He's going to unravel. We are seeing the signs. She pointed to Trump going back to conspiracy theories, denying things he's admitted before, his being drawn to violent videos. I don't know what violent videos he's watching, but... and her prediction is Trump is going to get worse and he will become uncontainable within the pressures of the presidency. I throw this up here because psychiatrists have actually studied the mental stability of presidents. And for what it's worth, A recent book came out and arguing that based on looking at presidential papers and their public statements, fully a quarter of them were mentally ill while they were in office. So maybe that says more about the individuals who want to be president than it does about their fit for that office in terms of post-election evaluations. And by mental illness they say, we've had alcoholics, we've had people who are depressed, people who are anxious. They claim Teddy Roosevelt was bipolar, manic, and then depressed. I don't know. But the point is, when they're questioning your mental fitness for office, that's not conducive to strong leadership. And of course, one of the things that is unusual is Donald Trump is prone to say things that are untrue, factually incorrect, which contributes to this idea that he's mentally unstable. And all sorts of news sources have been checking. This is just one I threw up here. PolitiFact scoring his statements. Only 5% of the ones that they went and evaluated. So again, this is kind of a slippery criteria, but it gives you an idea. Are considered true. Mostly false, or pants on fire are almost 60% of his statements. So we have a president who is a congenital liar, or at least an exaggerator, serial exaggerator of the truth. And the media loves this stuff because they can sit there and tell you seriously, Donald Trump said blah, 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 and it is untrue, we fact-checked this. But here's the thing, his supporters don't care. They do not care. And I would go to his rallies. In the introduction, Nancy said, I spent my leave going to his rallies. I talked to you previously in a talk about those. And not just his rallies, I went to all of their rallies. Spent my whole leave year going up and down the East Coast to these campaign rallies. And Donald Trump was the same way at his rallies. He would make these extravagant claims, and the audience would laugh and cheer, and he said, I'm going to build a wall, and he would pause, and everybody would look at each other, and the crowd would titter, and he'd say, okay, who's going to build a wall? And they would say, Mexico! And then high-five each other. Did they really think Mexico was going to build a wall? I actually asked them, no, they didn't think that. That wasn't the point. The point was that he was addressing themes, immigration, income inequality, trade, that mattered to them. He seemed to care for them in a way the established parties did not. And I think his candidacy and his presidency was best captured in a wonderful article by Selena Zito, in which she said, the press takes him literally, and she wrote this during the campaign, but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously, but not literally. And I think that's absolutely right. The reporters are very carefully fact-checking every one of his statements, but it doesn't matter, because his supporters are not taking him literally. They're taking him thematically, right? He is addressing concerns of them. Now, I'm not trying to excuse the fact that this guy is a serial exaggerator, and that's a positive, that is a sort of a nice way of saying that he's a congenital liar. We probably don't want presidents doing that. But I wonder if the media, in its focus on certain aspects of his presidency and his candidacy and his statements, are missing a big part of the picture. And I say this because they were woefully behind in covering his presidential campaign. I was out there, and I was woefully behind. I had made the famous prediction, of course, that he wasn't going to win election, and I had kind of mocked his candidacy, and then I started going to his rallies and realized this guy was touching on some very real concerns of a substantial portion of Americans. And I'm not sure the media ever took him seriously, and I'm not sure they do now. One reflection of that is approval ratings. So this is Gallup poll approval ratings over the first year of every president, dating back to Eisenhower. He's the earliest that we really have a consistent. And a couple of things should be clear to you. Early presidents' approval ratings were both positive, that is, they were above the zero line, and generally stable. But as you've moved into more recent time, the overall approval ratings have dropped lower. George Herbert Walker Bush was an exception because of the war in the Persian Gulf, but his dropped later. But you can see not only are they lower, but they begin to decline very early. Again, the exception here, George W. Bush, that's 9/11, and it begins to decline. But think of Barack Obama. Starts fairly popular, steady decline over his first year. almost identical to Donald Trump, except Donald Trump started from a much lower initial level, but he also has seen a decline. Now, I don't know whether this reflects the fact that our campaigns have become more negative, our media is more negative, our parties are more polarized, but people are generally holding presidents to a higher standard and seeing that they fall short. And this is all presidents. Now, I'll just finish up on my hasty overview. He has recently had a couple of successes. So the tax reform bill passed the Senate on a straight party vote, passed the House almost on a straight party vote, 12 Republicans from states that have income tax exemptions on their state tax, California, New Jersey, and New York, voting against it. No Democrats voted for his tax overhaul, by the way. And then a spending bill that avoided the fiscal cliff by raising caps on domestic and military spending, passed in bipartisan fashion, the Senate and the House. Democrats liked it because it raised the caps on domestic spending. Republicans on military spending, both of them sort of ignored the fact that it increased our deficit to levels that we haven't seen in a long time. But those have boosted Trump's popularity just a bit. So since the Republican tax plan became law in December, public opinion of it has improved not only among Republicans who strongly or somewhat approve, but even among Democrats. It's still low, but approval of the tax bill has gone up. And those who disapprove has gone down. So that has helped the tax bill. And more generally, people's sense of the economy is increasingly positive. So in thinking about the nation's economy, how would you rate economic conditions in this country? Excellent, good, only fair, or poor? The most recent one that I could get was in March. 11% excellent, 42% good. So only more than half of Americans said the economy was excellent or good. By the way, that's the highest totals we've had since 2004. So perceptions of the economy are actually quite positive. And those are beginning to spill over in Trump's approval ratings. They're inching up. They're not great. Here's the bottoming out. He started very low. This is the percentage approved, the black line. Each one of these dots, by the way, is just an individual poll. The red being the disapprove, the gray the approve. He started out very low, below 50%, dropped down to about 36%. That was his lowest point. He's now climbed about 6 percentage points. He's at about 41%. At a comparable period, Barack Obama was at 43%. So he's still not as popular as Barack Obama, but he's going in the right direction. So what does this say? It says there is light at the end of the tunnel, maybe. Again, things seem to be going well in North Korea. We've been talking about foreign policy. It's unclear about what this announcement by North Korea that they've suspended their testing means. Trump is supposedly laying the groundwork for talking with them. The French President Macron is coming over to talk a little bit about dealing with Syria. He's going to try to get Trump to hold the withdrawal of troops from Syria, keep some in northern Syria. The missile strikes were generally reviewed positively by the public. We can debate on whether they actually did anything. This is, of course, the strikes when the retaliation for the use by Assad of chemical weapons. All I'm trying to say here is that the situation has gotten worse. It may be getting better. We can evaluate this in the Q&A. Of course, there's this link, right? The Mueller investigation. And we hear, depending on who we talk to, it's almost over, it's not over, it's collusion, it's not collusion. I don't know what's going on. I don't think anybody knows what's going on. But that is the other shoe that we're waiting to drop. All right. That's my hasty overview of the Trump presidency. Again, I'm just giving you a sense of strategically how he has accomplished what he's accomplished. I make no claim here that you like what he's accomplished, and that's not my job here. It is to sort of put it in context. So let me finish up here by talking about the big picture. How did we get here? You'll recall back in June 2015, I think it was June, Donald Trump on the escalator riding down to the lobby to announce he was running for president with Melania looking dazed alongside him. And I can tell you, that experts thought this guy had a shelf life of about 2 weeks. And I will put myself in that category. I didn't think this guy was going anywhere. I wrote a very famous, infamous blog post that basically said, for the first time in my life, I'm going to vote for a presidential candidate, and I'm voting for Donald, and it ended up, you're hired. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek. Well, we turned out to be wrong. Of course, he immediately shot to the top of the polls shortly after declaring that Mexicans, some of whom are rapists and murderers, are coming across, and then proceeded to insult John McCain, and his poll ratings went up. And I'm not going to repeat, but he caught it on fire. And not just among Republicans, but he did okay in the general election, even though he lost the popular vote. The 2016 election was not transformative. Another book just came out. Amy Chozick has been going around a book, and she makes the same claim that many people made before. Hillary Clinton blew this election by running a miserable campaign. It's not true. She actually did about as well as we expected she would do in the popular vote. She did about as well as Barack Obama. She came within 100,000 votes of his total in 2012. The difference was Trump boosted his performance relative to Romney's. Got about 2 million more votes. Still lost the popular vote, 48.5 to 46.4, with a moderately high turnout. It went up to about 60% from 58. So this wasn't a hugely transformative election, but there was enough change in key places to flip control of the presidency, right? Now, coming out of that election, and this is a long-standing trend, there was a belief, because 90% of Republicans voted for Trump and 89% of Democrats voted Republican, that ours is a deeply divided, deeply polarized country. And graphs like this that show the median person who calls himself a Democrat, and again, we're arrayed here on a liberal to conservative, and we ask individuals a series of survey questions and then categorize them as either right of Attila the Hun or left of Bernie Sanders or somewhere in between. And you can see over a 10-year period, the parties have moved apart. And that's consistent with the broader argument that you hear about pundits that we are a deeply polarized nation. And 2016 exposed that division, or at least reinforced it. And a lot of other things happened. The election was very nationalized. By nationalized, this is looking at the House seats dating back to 1956. I'm not going to tell you how I did this. I had a lot of work from research assistants. But basically, if we're looking at Peter Welch running for the House, and we want to know why he won election, we want to know how much of it was because of influences within the state of Vermont, and how much was influenced outside of the state of Vermont, like people bringing money in here and so on. That's what this is measuring. And what we're seeing is, in general, influences on the House elections are increasingly nationalized. So that in 2016, it was the most nationalized election we've had in over a century. What do I mean by nationalized? I mean the rising tide, or ebbing tide, affects all members of the party equally. Brand name really matters. And of Republicans, the most important brand name was Donald Trump. So Donald Trump boosted Republican fortunes in key states, but also hurt him in other states. That's what we mean by nationalized elections. This is very important, because it means Donald Trump, like it or not, has become the figurehead of the Republican Party, and Republican legislators, like it or not, really have to support him for their own political futures. A couple other quick slides I'll show you. Again, lends support to the idea that we are deeply polarized. This is the number of ballots that are split. This is the number of district majorities that are split. By split, I mean a majority of the voters voted for the presidency of one party in 2012 or 16, and voted for the House member of the other party. And you can see in 2000, this is 12, I haven't been able to update this, the number of districts that have a representative from one party and yet voted for the president of the other party is at the lowest level since the turn of the century. So we're having straight party voting. Similarly, this is the number of individuals who split their ticket. That is, when they cast their ballot, they say, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, but also for House, I'm going to vote for Peter Welch, a Democrat and a Republican. That has dropped to the lowest level since we've been able track it, 1952. What does this mean? It means individuals consistent with this nationalized election are voting for one party or the other party. That's it. And that contributes to this perception that we are a deeply polarized nation. And there's lots of other data I could show you and your eyes would glaze over. But when we ask, what do you think about the other party? Increasingly, Republicans think Democrats are out of step and that they're the epitome of evil. And we ask Democrats, what do you think about Republicans? The same thing. Republicans are the epitome of evil, they're out of step. So our views towards the opposing party have become much more negative. What does this mean? It means if you look at Congress, Congress is bitterly divided. This is the Senate on the top row. This is the House on the bottom row. And we're looking from 1973, Senate and House. 20 years later, 1993, Senate and House. 2011, 2012, and I could show you 2016, it's just not on the same chart. What are we measuring? Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. Again, we have our left-right, so we categorize each individual member on their voting record. -1 means I'm left of Bernie Sanders. +1 means I'm right of Rand Paul. And we categorize them and we add up how many fall on each place. And you can see in the Senate, most people were bunched up in the middle. And then they begin to divide. And then they begin to divide as the middle disappears. There are very few independent senators. You can count them on one hand. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Joe Manchin. Most of them are either solidly liberals, solidly Republican. Very few moderates. Same thing in the House. Used to be bunched up in the middle 40 years ago, begin to split, and now there is no middle in the House. No middle. Congress is deeply polarized, makes it incredibly difficult to get major legislation done on anything. Even if you have a president like Donald Trump, who ostensibly wants to do bipartisan things like infrastructure spending, can't get any support for it. Immigration reform, which requires bipartisanship, can't get any support for it. Why? Republicans don't want immigration reform because it's a path to citizenship. Democrats don't want it because you're spending money on that wall. And so the two won't agree, right? And that reflects this division there. All right. Final sort of big picture slide. Well, not the final one. One other way. This is the division between the two parties. The scale here is the distance between the parties, and again, it's measured on voting records, dating back to 1879. So the blue is the Senate, the House is the red line, and you can see the division between the two parties is the highest it has ever been in history. Again, we can't go back before 1879. In other words, the differences between Democrats and Republicans in the House, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate is as big as it has ever been, as far back as we can measure. That's how unusual we're living in. So when you look at Donald Trump and his presidency, you cannot evaluate it without looking at this. This is what he's struggling to deal with, whether you like him or not. He's dealing with unprecedented politics. Now, I promised you before that Donald Trump's election did not signify a dramatically shifting underlying voting coalition of either party. But it did reflect an incremental change that has been going over a long time, particularly among a class of voters. So, Clinton's margin over Trump was lower than Obama's margin over Romney in 37 states. So even though she had 100,000 votes, give or take, in terms of the popular election with Obama, in fact, did about well, she did spread those votes out very well. That was her problem. She actually outperformed him in states like Texas and California, but it was useless because Texas was not going to go Democrat and California was already hers. So her problem was not the overall level of support, it's where the support was. And in 37 states, she just underperformed Obama. And in particular, she underperformed him in key states from Pennsylvania to the Dakotas. So even though voting statistics in 2016 don't look very different from 2012, Small changes at the margins, because of the way we elect presidents, can have huge consequences, and they did. So even though I'm going to argue, contrast to all the pundits, I thought she ran a very effective campaign. It was a campaign that mobilized voters in the wrong areas. And we can see this. These are states won by Romney and also by Trump. These are states won by Obama and also Clinton. These are states that flipped. And you can see they flipped right here. And what's distinctive about here? A lot of lower to middle income white voters who have lost their jobs because of trade, because of perceptions about immigration, all the things that Donald Trump's candidacy stood for. He was incredibly astute at recognizing that, and he went there. In the last 100 days, Hillary Clinton did not go to Wisconsin at all. He went there 6 times, right? And he understood that there was this undercurrent of discontent that had been growing for some time. And I just love this picture, so I just wanted to show it again. It was an undercurrent that I discovered talking to these Trump supporters. There was a tendency in the media to think they were all deranged, goose-stepping, brown-shirted fascists who were racist. And we can talk about the degree to which Trump's support was racist. But a lot of them were just people like you and me, who just felt like their kids had no future. Had no future. They weren't in their own position economically distressed. I mean, I'm in states like New Hampshire where they were actually doing pretty well. But they were talking about their kids. My kid just got out of college. He's got $100,000 in loans. There's no way he's going to be able to pay these off. No way they're going to have the American dream. Trump tapped into that, and I got a sense of that in these campaigns when I went to my first campaign rally, and I'm not going to make you look at all my vacation, how I spent my vacation pictures again. But his rallies were bigger, they were more boisterous, they were more festive than any other rally I went to except for Bernie Sanders. Bernie was the other big boisterous rallies. Of course, Bernie's were more moralistic and preachy. His was not preachy. His was more like a rock star type thing. All right. So what did he capitalize on? He capitalized on this. Here is the breakdown in Democratic partisanship by race in education. And I'm just going to show you race in education back to 1992. And this is the support for the Democrat, the advantage relative to the Republican. So if you're 0 or above, you're supporting the Democratic candidate. Below that, you're supporting the Republican candidate. And you can see African American voters have been consistently supporting the Democratic presidential candidate. There was a spike in 2008. But Hillary did pretty well in 2016 among African Americans. Now, again, this isn't telling you turnout. They didn't turn out in as high in numbers as they did for Obama. But when they did turn out, they voted for her as just as great as numbers as she did for him. Same with Hispanic and Asians. Again, they have been less in the wedded to Democrats, but still consistently so. And again, she did slightly worse among Latinos than a lot of the polling suggested, but still, and there's some dispute on the Latino vote, she still won them by, Trump got about 30% of them. Here's the difference. We have seen that white people, by education, have been bifurcating. So historically, educated white voters have been voting Republican, that's the blue line, relative to Democrats. But they have been, that support has been eroding as the white college degree urban professionals have settled in urban areas. They have begun drifting Democratic, right? Think of these as the Facebook voters, right? The ones that the Russians manipulated with their bots. No, that's not true. Okay, so they are now split about evenly between Democrats and Republicans. Notice white people with some college, that's this, and white people who only have a high school degree or lower. The white people with high school degree, they used to be the core of the New Deal, Democrats. They were the manufacturing class. They were the workers. They didn't need to get a college degree because they had those good manufacturing jobs. They have begun leaving the Democratic Party even before this slide, but you can see it's a long-term trend. So they have become the least likely Democratic voter. These are exactly the ones that Trump targeted. But notice, their turning away from the Democratic Party precedes Trump. He articulated views that were already there. And he reached out to voters whose sentiments preceded him. Hillary Clinton did not. She was not able to reach out to that class of voters. She did worse than Barack Obama among white voters, white lower income voters, which is why a lot of us think the racial component to Trump's support is overstated. Because a lot of white people were more likely to vote for Barack Obama, even lower educated white people, than they were for Hillary Clinton. All right, so that's the point. So what, and I heard someone say she's a woman, and that's another issue that we can talk about. All right, so what do I want to finish up here? I want to make the claim that there is deep dissatisfaction among our voters. Donald Trump tapped into that dissatisfaction. The reason we don't see huge changes in the elections is because, for the most part, our two major parties are controlled by donor classes and activists, and they just trot out the same candidates. It's Clinton, Bush, Obama was sort of a break, and then another Clinton. And if you're going to give them the same choices, they are going to make the same voting decisions, even if they're deeply unhappy. But there is enough unhappiness in key areas that even slight changes, as reflected in that unhappiness, can flip election outcomes, even though in the broad aggregate, voting looks very stable and very polarized. Why do people appear polarized? Their choices are polarized. They don't have centrist candidates to choose from. They just have a woman who is appealing to progressives and racial identity politics, or a conservative who, like in Mitt Romney's case, was for free markets and neocon intervention in countries overseas. Donald Trump, in this sense, was a break from that precedent. He wasn't a huge break, he wasn't hugely popular, but enough voters latched on to him that he flipped the presidency. And this is a long-term problem. And I'm going to finish up here and take questions. Stable function, now here I'm quoting Morris Theory, a very good political scientist. Stable function is a function of stable choices, but it leads to overreach and dissatisfaction. When you keep voting the same people into office, they keep doing the same thing. Republicans pursue free market policies and neocon intervention overseas. We throw them out. Democrats pursue racial identity politics and immigration road path to citizenship. We throw them out. Because the public is in the middle. They want desperately bipartisan solutions. They want people to agree. They want things to get done. The result, we have two ideologically cohesive parties backed by their donor classes, engaged in political overreach, screaming at the other side, voting, primarying anyone in their own party who dares compromise. And the public is increasingly dissatisfied. And the result is unstable majorities. What do I mean by unstable majorities? Okay, hasty history. 1896 to 1930. R means this institution is controlled by a Republican. D means it was controlled by a Democrat. If we just simply look at our government as controlled by either Republicans or Democrats, and we look at the three major governing institutions, we have the President, we have the House, we have the Senate, there's 8 possible outcomes. Trust me on that. You can have all Republicans, all Democrats, Republican President, Democratic Senate, you get the idea. Well, in this period, this is a period of Republican dominance. They governed the presidency except for the anomalous election of Woodrow Wilson, because Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate and split the vote and managed to get Democrats in. But this was a period of Republican dominance. New Deal, Great Depression. We get fed up with the Republicans, we throw them out. This is a period of Democratic dominance. They win the presidency until a war hero breaks that. They control the House, except for the brief anomaly after the war. Period of Democratic dominance. You with me? Yeah. 52-92, we have a period of split government. The presidency, beginning with Eisenhower, generally is controlled by Republicans. Although there's an exception. Kennedy might have won in 1960. We're still debating that. And as a result of the Watergate, Carter got in there for one term. but it's been the Republican presidency. The House, on the other hand, and I'm not going to go into why this is, remained Democratic in this period, and the Senate went back and forth, mostly Democratic. So the period was stable, but it was stable with divided government. We were dividing our... Now, look at what we're in. We are in a period, remember that was 8 different configurations? We've gone through 6 of them over since 1992. And if current polls are, we're going to do the 7th in 2018, the 7th being Democrats controlling the House, Republicans controlling the Senate, and the presidency still in Republican hands, obviously, since Trump is, unless he's impeached. So we've seen no stability. Anytime one party controls all 3 branches, the public says nope and throws them out. We have the Republicans here, remember? After the Republicans coming off the 9/11 were able to cement majorities in 2004, Karl Rove wrote this book, The Coming Republican Majority, about how Republicans were going to dominate politics for as long as the eye could see. It was the era of McKinley, that previous period again. That lasted not quite 50 years, it lasted 2, right? Sorry. And we had the recession, we had Hurricane Katrina, Democrats took over Congress. Barack Obama was elected, remember that? Realignment? We were having a majority-minority, all growing Hispanic African-American population. Democrats were going to control, the Republicans were the party of white people. They were never going to win again. That lasted 2 years. Tea Party. Overreach. Healthcare. Right? Climate change. And so on. We're now in the period of Republican domination. All Republicans. How long is that going to last? Current polls, 2 years. So we are in a period of unstable majorities, and that reflects deep dissatisfaction among the public. And we want to know why Donald Trump was elected? He is a symptom of our deep distrust of establishment politics, our 2 parties. The one thing Donald Trump had going for him was he could stand up there authentically, and I saw this in rally after rally, and say, you know what? I'm not part of this problem. I didn't create it. And I know how these people operate. You know why? Because I'm rich. And I gave money to both of them, both parties, because that's how you got to get things done, because the system is rigged. It's rigged against little people like you, people who have no say in the political system. That's why Donald Trump won. Now, his message was not a message that resonated with everybody, but it capitalized on these trends with enough people in enough places to give him the presidency. It was no guarantee that once in office he was going to get anything done. And in fact, we can argue about how much he has got done. But the point is, since 1992, we've experienced 6 of 8 possible configurations. I think we're going to have the 7th. And I'm not going to have you go through this because I just sort of took it. But Trump is as much a symptom of political instability as he is a cause. And now I'm going to leave you with a picture designed to sober you. All right, questions?
Oh, no.
Yes?
Who are they behind Trump? Because he didn't come up with all these ideas. Who were the Trump whisperers?
We can't believe this guy.
I really,
Yeah, you know, I don't know. You know, I have to be honest with you. I didn't think he was going to win election. And then when he did win election, I mean, part of the problem is that the media, up until the point that Trump won election, was talking about how Hillary Clinton's campaign that was data-driven, this analytical campaign, it used all of the wisdom that Obama had. And there was, I remember an article in October in Political Magazine that went behind the scenes, pulled back the curtains behind the brainiacs who were running Hillary's data analysis, and how it was running circles, because what did Donald Trump have? He had Jared Kushner sitting with one computer in some lonely warehouse in Texas. And Hillary had a staff of 600 and tons of computers. They had an algorithm.
What was the themes for him?
I'm getting to that point.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. I like to talk. And so, what happened? Trump won. And so the media said, oh wait, we had it wrong. Trump ran a brilliant campaign. And he had the data analytics, and Jared was brilliant. And now 6 to 8 months in, Jared is in deep trouble, and he seems like he's completely incompetent. That's all a long way of saying, people don't believe this, but I think this is Trump. I think Trump is calling his own shots. I think he's in charge of the ship. I think he's incredibly, intuitively smart, in the sense that he, and I don't know how he's able to do this, but he is a politician who understood where this discontent was coming from. And I think a lot of it is he just throws things out there and sees what sticks and what gets a response. And he says, I'm going to say this, and let's see what the New York Times and the Washington Post say. And if they come out against it, he says, my God, I've got something. I've got something that is going to sell in the Midwest. Because they hate the New York Times. They hate the Washington Post. They think it's the party of the elites, the Amtrak, you know. And I says, I'm going to say something and see if CNN spends 4 hours dissecting it. If they do, I got something. So I think Donald Trump is calling these shots, and I think he's doing it in a very seat-of-the-pants, intuitive way. I'm going to throw a tweet out there, run it up the tweet flagpole, see who salutes. And I can tell you, at the campaign, the rallies I went to, it was about his 50th rally. He knew instantly what lines were going to evoke what the greatest response is. And I know a lot of you probably find this uncomfortable, but when he runs his quasi-campaign rallies now as president, I recommend you go on C-SPAN, or if they show it on cable, watch one of those rallies. You can't do it. A lot of you can't do it. I didn't think I could do it, but you go there and you realize this guy is connecting with a certain group of voters. And the Republican establishment, as much as they hate this guy, never wanted him to be president, they're stuck with him. I mean, the only thing worse than having him as president was having him not as president, having a Democrat. So they kind of, because we're in an era of nationalized elections, they kind of have to go with him. That's the sort of the rock and the hard place they're in. Paul Ryan decided, you know, I said during the entire campaign, this guy should not be president. Then he was president, I decided to work with him, and now I decided I'd rather go hang out with my family than be House Speaker anymore. Yeah, question?
I was going to reverse what you said and say he's stuck with them.
Well, in what sense? To elaborate.
I think a lot of the Republican discomfort is with the rhinos. I happen to know McCain personally, and he's one of the foulest people I've ever met.
Foulest in terms of language?
Well, in terms of his central core. I knew him as a junior officer.
Uh-huh. So his central core is his political convictions, or?
No, his personal character.
Okay.
Yes. And his roommate was in my squadron, so I got to know the guy really well. And then I met him, and I've never seen a more decadent junior officer in the United States Navy.
Well, you sound like Donald Trump.
Well, he is, but then you got another thing here. He's offended by Trump because he won where he didn't. So he has a jealousy component in there, which I think was a driver behind his vote to turn down the Obamacare.
Okay.
And he is a rhino. There's no question he's a rhino.
Okay, so I think you know, we can debate motivations, and I'm not going to get into motivation, but I think you're tapping into something here, which is we're in a long-term process of seeing the traditional Republican Party being hollowed out.
Yep.
Donald Trump is the wave of the future for the Republican Party. The traditional Republican Party is sort of the country club Republican parties, right? Affluent, business-oriented, free trade. It was taken over a little bit with the neoconservative movement, foreign policy-wise. We're going to remake the world in America's image. Donald Trump's against everything the traditional Republican Party stands for. And a good chunk of voters who are sort of on the margins between these parties didn't know whether to go to Bernie because of his free trade, anti-free trade, or Trump. So, and the Democratic Party is changing as well. That's what I was trying to get at that slide. The traditional core of the New Deal were sort of middle to lower income white manufacturing voters. They have been deserting the Democratic Party, which they think has become the party of sort of identity politics and urban professionals who are interested in things that don't matter to me. Same-sex marriage, right? Abortion rights. Those, morally speaking, are important issues, and I don't mean to discount those, but if you've got a kid with a 4-year college education who can't pay his loan off, you're wishing your party would do a little bit more about keeping jobs, high-paying manufacturing jobs, than pushing same-sex marriage, right? It's hard for us in this state to sort of grasp that. So I think your larger point, we can debate the motives, but your larger point is right. Trump has captured a portion of the electorate that is, for better or for worse, calling themselves Republicans now.
His kids call him a blue-collar billionaire. His associates can't stand his guts.
Oh yeah, no.
Because they think he's a turncoat on everything that they stood for. And instead, he's coming out for the American people. And I think this is what we're going to see down the road.
Well, so the turncoat part is, you know, on a lot of the social issues, he's more Democratic than he is Republican, and so he just sort of didn't say anything about them during the campaign, never came up with the rallies. The only social issue that he obviously switched on was abortion, but that's sort of a litmus test to get through the Republican, and so the evangelical voters support him, right? They support a guy who's, you know, marriages are, well, you know, the whole, I haven't talked about Stormy Daniels and any of that stuff. I'm hoping not to. But, you know, that's partly because he has stayed away from taking a clear-cut stand on a lot of social issues in order not to offend sort of the evangelicals and sort of aligned himself on these economic issues. So we are in the middle, you know, elections and coalitions change. They change very slowly. And sometimes we don't see them until the change becomes obvious. So those, if I looked at these states, and I can make a prediction here, if you look at these states have been trending Republican among rural and lower-income voters for some time. And I have a whole other talk where I sort of talk you going back to the 1940s about this. It just that it reached the tipping point in 2016, and he picked up another 2%. And that is enough to flip these states. The next state that's going to flip, I'm telling you, is this one, Minnesota. Minnesota has been consistently Democratic. Donald Trump, for reasons I couldn't understand until I looked at the data, went there in the closing days of 2016. He almost won that state. Right now, the Democratic vote in that state is centered in Minneapolis-St. Paul. Big urban area. Clinton actually expanded Obama's support there. You go in the outer areas of that state, and they're trending Republican. I have a student out there who was campaigning out there in 2016. He said, yeah, I went to Trump rally, and I couldn't believe it. People who said they had never been to a political rally in their life went in rural Minnesota just to see a Trump rally. So, you know, again, we're looking, Minnesota's never gone Republican for 40 years. But it's been trending Republican. It just hasn't reached that tipping point. And so if it goes Republican in 2020, people are going to say, my God, what happened? But it's been building for a while. And that's what Trump was able to do. He was able to capitalize on these trends in these states. Now, other states are trending the other way. California, for instance, is not going to help. It's trending Democrat, but it doesn't help because it's already Democratic. Texas is trending Democratic, but it's got a ways to go before it's going to flip. It might flip 3 or 4 elections down the road as the Latino population gets bigger, assuming Latinos still vote Democrat, which is a big if. So there's things going on all the time that don't always show up in the election results, and the press tends to miss those. So in 2016, they sort of overstated what Trump had done, but Trump was as much a symptom as he was a cause. Yeah.
Since you're talking about states, do you have any thoughts about the midterms?
I do. I have a whole slide presentation, which I cut off. So the midterm, the 2 things to keep in mind about all first midterm in a new president's, the president's party always lose seats. There has been 2 exceptions in the last 100 years. 1998, actually it was the second midterm, Bill Clinton and the Democrats gained seats, but that was the Monica Lewinsky. George Bush in 2002, Republicans actually gained seats, but that was 9/11. So barring a 9/11, knock on wood, or an impeachment, knock on wood, Republicans are going to lose seats in 2018. The question is how many? On average, you lose 24 seats in the first midterm, on average, dating back 60 years.
Is that the combination of the House and the Senate?
Just the House.
Just the House.
Just the House. If Republicans lose 24 seats, the House flips. Democrats are in control. There are a couple of things to look at One is, how is the economy going? When it goes well, it tends to help Republicans, or it helps the president's party. It's going well. Donald Trump hasn't been very good at telling people it's going well, although he's now running ads on the tax. How many have seen the tax cut ads? They're now running in Vermont. It's a 501c3 is running an ad touting the benefits of the tax cuts. So the economy might help soften that blow, but on the other hand, Paul Ryan's resignation is one of record number of resignations, both among Democrats and Republicans, but particularly Republicans. That's usually a sign that they see a coming wave. And finally, the special elections that we've had so far, they've been special, so I wouldn't want to generalize, but they've tended to favor Democrats, and the big thing about them, the enthusiasm level among the Democrats has been very high. So, and not just Alabama, where Roy Moore, I mean, the Democrats aren't always going to get lucky and have a candidate like Roy Moore as their opponent. But there's a lot of signs here that say Democrats are going to do better than expected. The one sort of working against them is the economy. So what you really need to do to take advantage of the context is you've got to run strong candidates. And that's the unknown here. You know, are they going to pick up 24? Well, it depends a lot on whether they get good candidates to run for office and fund them. So have me back in May, June, July, August. Have me back in 4 months, and I'll be able to show you my forecast models. Right now, the forecast models show the Democrats getting about 27 seats. Enough to take the House. The Senate is a trickier thing. The Senate, obviously, Democrats, very quickly, and I'll get to your question, Democrats only need to flip a couple, but almost all of the seats that are up have Democratic incumbents, and 10 of them are in states that Trump won. So we have Democratic incumbents fighting against their own state tide. So I'm less optimistic, if you were a Democrat, that the Senate is going to flip. But the difference is the margin is much smaller. You just need to run a stupid candidate, the Roy Moore equivalent.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you did breakdowns for races. How about breakdown for age groups?
So one of the most fascinating things is when you talk to my students, they are the most, the 18 to 24-year-olds are the most dissatisfied with both political parties, the most willing to embrace an outside candidate, the least likely to vote Republican, and that bodes well if you're a Democrat looking down the road. The problem for Democrats is they're least likely to vote. So the turnout among 18 to 24-year-olds. The older you get, the stronger the support for Donald Trump, believe it or not. So there's a deep age difference there. People are always shocked. Wait, who are you who is supporting Trump? So there is a definite age issue. And again, if you're looking down the road, you say that favors the Democrats, along with the growing minority population in this country, which has been leaning Democrat. But it hasn't turned out to help them so far, partly because these groups don't vote as high, partly because they're concentrated in areas where they can't help flip elections. And the other thing I keep in mind is parties aren't stupid. Republicans are going to start running candidates who are going to reach out, particularly to Latino voters in these key states like Texas and so on. George Bush was somebody who did actually pretty well among Latino voters. So demographics is not destiny, whether it's education or race or age, because parties change their message as the voting blocks become increasingly important. Yeah?
What about Florida?
Yes. Florida is what we call a purple state. So I was down there in 2016, and it really depends on where you go. But part of the problem is that it is a state in flux, both because of retirees coming in, but also there's a growing Latino population. There's a growing immigrant population. It's really hard. I mean, it's going to be a battleground state for time to come. It's really hard to sort of put that. It's one of those, you know, when you think about where the candidates went in 2016, and again, there's really only about 12 states that are battleground states, and Florida is ground zero. One of the states that used to be a battleground state, by the way, Ohio, ground zero, it's no longer a battleground state. It has gone Republican, and Democrats can just write that off in the immediate future. It's just the way things, that Midwest, it's just heading in that direction, and you know, the East and West Coast is heading in the other direction. Yeah.
I'm
Sure.
curious, you had mentioned at all about the morality issue
Yeah.
that is cutting across the country. Stormy Daniels,
Yeah.
but also the Me Too generation
Yep.
that's emerging politically.
I had a great conversation. I hold these weekly politics luncheons. Some of you come to them over at the college, and we had a great conversation on the Me Too, in which I had two women screaming at each other. One
Where do we get to that?
One of your generation, your cohort, and I'm generalizing about all of you as being sort of middle-aged compared to my students who are not. And, you know, the Me Too morality thing, it's interesting to see that dynamic play out. Younger women are all over it and saying, you know, this types of behavior that's gone on for years that we find acceptable, we're no longer to tolerate that. And Al Franken, I know you might have just put your hand in the wrong place, but you're out. There's no way you should be in office. Talk to older women, and they say, are you kidding me? This is, you know what we went through? And you just learned you just toughen up, and you learn that you just have to throw somebody out, because men are stupid sometimes, and they do these things, and that's just the way it is, and you recognize that. And it was an interesting dynamic. There's a generational dynamic playing out on the Me Too movement. And I hate to say it, but you guys are not the future. They're the future. And it was interesting to see how they reacted to Roy Moore and Al Franken. A lot of staunch older Democrats said, why would you sacrifice your own Al Franken, who is so good for women's issues and progressive, just because of some alleged comment made by some woman? And it even got deeper, which was very interesting, because I have to be very careful as a professor. You know, I had to say nothing on this, but I'll throw it out because you guys might find it interesting. One of the older women in my audience said, you know, part of my uncomfortableness about this debate is I look at what the students are wearing on campus. And she said, I can't believe what they wear on campus. And you have to be cognizant of basic biological differences between men and women. You just have to recognize that. And I knew this was coming. One of my younger students stood up and said, what are you talking about? I mean, that is the most sexist thing, critiquing the older woman, is saying, some days I just feel like I feel empowered, I want to wear this. And that's my business. That doesn't give you any right to do anything. It was a fascinating conversation, which I'm sure many of you have had in the privacy. Of course, as a professor, I sat there and said, okay. That's a long way of saying I think morality is playing out differently among different cohorts, age-wise. I think it's also viewed through a partisan lens. I think, remember Bill Clinton with his bimbo eruptions? And Democrats thought when he was impeached because he was lying or obstructing justice because he didn't own up to having a sexual relation with Monica Lewinsky, Democrats flocked to his side saying that was a private matter. And now Stormy Daniels, Republicans saying it's a private matter. Right? So I don't think Stormy Daniels is flipping anybody's opinion about Donald Trump any more than Monica Lewinsky did about Bill Clinton. The difference might be legally. Donald Trump's campaign might be in trouble by paying hush money. That may violate some campaign laws. We'll have to see how that plays out. But the morality issue, Americans tend to view a morality through a pre-existing lens. And, you know, I'm not saying they're dismissing it, but it doesn't look like it's changing the underlying dynamics very much. Yes?
So, from this point of view, my point of view, I'm very concerned about sort of where our government goes from here and
Yep.
the state of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
The polarization, whether it's of our choice
Me
or
too.
the polarization of our, concerns me greatly. And I'm just interested in, do you have any words of comfort or wisdom
So,
about where we go from here?
yeah, I'm worried as well. I'm worried about the failure of the political class to listen to people. I just think it's a big problem. I will say a couple of things sort of in defense. The younger generation, if I could just get them active, by not voting, I'm sure I'm setting a good role model for them. They are concerned about these issues, and they're passionate about changing things. So they're not like they're turning off, but my worry about them is they're much more willing and Pete's seen some of this on our college campus, they're much more willing to embrace what some of us are reluctant to encourage, which is sort of tearing down existing norms and institutions because they just don't think they don't work. So we had a huge debate on Middlebury campus over free speech. An older generation said, you know, you guys are crazy and you can't riot and shut down speech just because you don't like it. But the younger students think, no, this is the only way our voices are going to be heard. So the key for me is trying to channel that younger activism, enthusiasm, without tearing down the institutions. And that's my second point. American institutions have proved very resilient. Very resilient. And by institutions, I mean our electoral system, which sort of makes it difficult to have whole-scale changes on the basis of just minor changes in political control. So Donald Trump, a lot of us feared Donald Trump and his authoritarian tendencies. But the reality is it's kind of difficult for presidents to do things. And we hated that when you supported Barack Obama. You hated the Republican opposition. You say, my God, why don't you let this guy govern? Instead, you just want to tear him down. Now you're saying, thank God for the Democratic opposition. Donald Trump can't get a thing done. That's what I mean by our institutions. They're very resilient. They're very resistant to extremism on either side. My worry is people are just going to drop out, and people are going to bid to tear down those institutions as they began to on the Middlebury campus with this long-standing defense of free speech. We've had a devil of a time putting that back in the can and sort of explain to students this isn't what we do. You know, I will finish with this point that I finished my lecture on, my introduction to American politics. We have an ongoing experiment in democracy. And there's no guarantee the experiment's going to turn out well. It's just every generation has to sort of learn through baptism by fire why we have the institutions we do. And I'm part of that educational process, you're part of that educational process, and you participate in it. So far, knock on wood, with the exception of the Civil War, we've handled most of these disputes peacefully. And the other, I guess the other words of wisdom, you guys lived through the 60s and 70s. In terms of society, we were in much worse shape then. Much worse shape. Rioting, violence, political leaders getting assassinated. Donald Trump tweets some things and it sends cable television in tizzy. But we're not nearly in the straits that they were then.
It seems to me he's doing a ton of damage there, so it's really hard to sit back and say, oh, well, he's not really accomplishing anything.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a whole realm of regulatory enforcement, use of administrative actions. I mean, one of the most clear-cut cases is DACA, right, which he was able to roll back. Even here, however, there's some pushback, and a lot of it's taking place in the courts. A lot of these groups are bringing suit, and so DACA, for instance, his effort, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Remember, Obama pushed that because he couldn't get legislation on comprehensive immigration reform. He pushed that through executive order, and of course we all said, oh, that's a good thing. And now Donald rescinds it through executive order, and we say, executive order is a bad thing. But you get to a broader point, which is presidents can do things within limits, unilaterally, and some of those things we don't like. And a lot of people will say that's a sign of a presidency out of control, but the caveat I would, and Obama found this out, when you do things through executive orders, they're not as permanent as getting things through legislation. And a lot of what Obama tried to do through executive orders and other administrative, the first thing Donald Trump did when he was elected president, he rolled them all back. So if it's any consolation, a lot of what he's trying to accomplish, Donald Trump probably won't survive his presidency, assuming you can elect a Democrat. And there's a lot of pushback going in the courts. And finally, bureaucrats often are very protective of their own programs, and they work behind the scenes. So Rod Rosenstein, Donald Trump might be screaming at him, but he, and you might think Donald Trump should be, but he's a bureaucrat who's protecting the integrity of the Department of Justice. There's a lot of bureaucrats who do that, who resist efforts by the executive to sort of run roughshod. So I don't mean to dismiss, I think your point is well taken, it's a good point. Trump is accomplishing things for better or for worse, through non-legislative means, as all presidents do. That's a more limited way in terms of durability of doing things, but it doesn't mean it's something you agree with. But that was a good point. All right, well, thank you very much. Doris, please.